Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Christy Kirkland. I'm the Student and Engagement Manager for the Partnership for Inclusive Innovation. We're so happy that you could join us today for our Smarter Together webinar. It's Healthy Georgia, exploring the impact of the energy transition on public health. Just a few housekeeping rules before we get started. The webinar is being recorded. If you have questions for our panelists, if you will put those in the chat function today, towards the end of the webinar, we'll save some time for Q&A. Also for attendees, if you would keep yourself muted throughout the webinar. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Sharon Murphy. She was with Georgia Tech's Strategic Energy Institute, and she will be the moderator for today's webinar.
Thank you, Christy. I am so excited and happy to be here today and to be joined by the panelists that we have today, because this intersection of energy and public health is something that I am personally passionate about. I have a background in public health, and to merge the two disciplines or things, energy with public health, is something that has not been something that hasn't been all that explicit in the past. And so at Georgia Tech, we are really trying to make this effort to bring this intersection to light such that we can start bringing this being a more proactive approach to public health outcomes to energy solutions, especially as we're transitioning from, fossil fuel-based energies into more sustainable energy solutions. And the energy life cycle, you can see, I'm going to show you a slide in just a minute, but it touches, public health touches every part of that energy life cycle. And there was a statistic that I read that energy is responsible for more mortality and morbidity in the world than tobacco. So if you think about that, that is an amazing statistic, and one that isn't thought about too much. And a lot of that comes from, dirty coal and the burning of biofuels. But go ahead and move to the next slide, please, Christy. So we need to understand that some of the greatest public health achievements of our time rely on energy. And I want to use infectious diseases as a result, right? So just community hygiene, transporting solid waste takes gas, piping of clean water into home, and those types of things are really what you would call public health victories. And let's take vaccines also, the production, storage, and distribution. That all takes different forms of energy. So already fundamentally, these are very intertwined. Next slide. This graphic right here, on the left, you're going to see the energy life cycle from resource extraction all the way through to decommissioning. And as you move to the right, you will see environmental implications, some of those health implications downstream, and some of those health implications and environmental health implications result in social inequities and social burdens. And we're going to address that in a little bit, but I'll give you an example of resource extraction. We can think of Black lung disease in coal miners, right? But we can also move that into the energy transition and think of the extraction of rare earth minerals that are needed for some of these renewable and sustainable technologies that we have. And that extraction process, it can be devastating to the environment, as well as the health of the people who are working in those mines, and then also to the decommissioning, right? So they have to be properly disposed of. So this gives you an example of just the big picture of energy and how it relates to public health. So next slide, please. Some of you who may not be familiar with what I'm talking about with the energy transition is there is a movement from having these centralized power plants that kind of fan out through our transmission lines to decentralized power grid, which you're talking about microgrids and smaller scale power generation sources serving a smaller area. There's also movement that most of you are aware of, fossil fuel into renewable energy solutions. So we're trying to transform this coupling into a proactive voice. An example I will give you would be California at one point mandated that a certain amount of fuel, gasoline, sold in the state had to be a certain amount ethanol. But one of the things they were using to make this possible turned out to be emitted in the vehicle emissions, and was polluting the land and the water. It was something called MTBE, and that was an unforeseen consequence. Another thing that we see is that in decommissioning with windmills, right, they have those giant wind turbine blades, and they cannot yet be recycled. And there are very few landfills that will take them. So as they fail or as they age, we need to think, what are we going to do with these things such that they do not have an adverse environmental impact? So that's kind of the big background on all of this. Next slide, please. This is just another overview of like other ways that energy and public health intersect that you may not have thought about: occupational health, community and personal stress, emergency response, medical energy security. So there's a lot of ways that these two intersect. Some of them are more downstream impacts and some of them are more immediate, but it's food for thought. So as we think about this discussion today, we're going to talk about, we can't talk about all of these, but in your mind, I would ask each of you to kind of try and think about some of these other impacts and intersections that energy and public health have, and to come away from this discussion with a new appreciation of how energy and the transition can impact public health. And so with that, I think that was my last slide. Let's remove that from the screen. Thank you. So we have three wonderful speakers here today, and my goal is to make this conversational today. So I'd like for you guys to feel free to use the chat function to make comments or ask questions throughout the discussion, and we will try to get to those questions as best we can and stay relevant. And we don't know where this conversation, it might take us in a different direction than the one that I have planned, but that's the goal for today. So in light of that, I would like to introduce our first panelist today, Sally Ng of Georgia Tech. Sally, would you care to just introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Sally Ng, and I'm a professor in the School of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering at Georgia Tech. I also have a joint appointment in the School of Earth and Atmospheric Science, and also a courtesy appointment in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering. So my research groups, we study air quality, air pollution, and their health effects. And one particular focus is on these particles called particulate matter, or PM, and these are particles are suspended in the air, or they're referred to as aerosols. So my group study their sources, how they are formed in the atmosphere throughout these complex reactions, and their impacts on health. So we do experiments in the lab in these control reactors to probe these different reactions. And we also take our instruments around the world to do measurements to characterize the air quality in these aspects. And we also collaborate with a lot of faculty here on campus to look at the health effects of aerosols. And just to kind of put in is that, I'm representing one of the many air quality colleagues here at Georgia Tech. We do have, one of the largest groups in the country, studying air qualities and health effects. So I'm very happy to be here today.
Thank you, Sally. And next, I would like to introduce Laura Taylor. Laura Taylor is also of Georgia Tech.
Yes, hi. Sorry, I had to unmute. I'm Laura Taylor, chair of the School of Economics and at Georgia Tech. And my background is in environmental economics, including studying the effects of air quality on health outcomes. So I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And last we have Andrea Pinnabel. Andrea, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, hello everyone. I'm Andrea Pinnabel. I'm hopefully on the backside of a cold, so I have my lemon water right here. So I apologize if I cough a little bit. I'm very happy to be here. I think this is a topic that is top of mind and has been an evolving topic in the world of sustainability for many years. And my background is in engineering. I'm a chemical engineer by education. I spent my career both as in the corporate sustainability space and then just most recently as the president of South Face Energy Institute located here in Atlanta.
Thank you, Andrea. I am so happy that you guys could join us today for this topic. I want to start with thanking Becky for her input on the slides about nuclear power, because again, this topic is just so big. And to be honest, I hadn't actually thought about nuclear power because sometimes you can just be so focused on, you know, fossil fuels or solar or whatever that you may not do that. So I appreciate your input. So in today's discussion, I'd like for everybody to feel comfortable kind of jumping in. And each of our panelists is currently addressing this intersection in different and very important ways. And they complement each other really well, even though they are different. So I would like to ask each of you just to take a couple moments to talk about where you currently are in this intersection. And maybe just tell us a little bit about research that you're doing or projects that you're working on currently or have in the recent past, and maybe a little bit about the future, where you think you see your research going. Sally, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So we have a couple, projects at the interface of energy and health, in a sense that, as I mentioned, my research group, we are mostly an experimental group, and we look at how these particles or particulate matter are formed from different emissions. So we do experiments in the lab to probe these emissions from like different sources, like vehicles or trees, and they emit these compounds called volatile organic compounds. And we do these experiments in the lab to how they actually got reacted away, and along the process, how do they make pollutants such as ozone and also these particulate matter pollutions. And some of the interactions that we are looking at the emissions of these nitrogen oxides from vehicles and also sulfur dioxide from power plants, and how do they actually interact with these volatile organic compounds to form aerosols, which will have very different composition and potentially also different health effects. And we also doing measurements in the ambient, actually, just right on top of our roof lab during the pandemic, because during the pandemic with the lockdown, there's a large decrease in these nitrogen oxides from cars and also sulfur dioxide from power plants. And so this is a really good opportunity to kind of look at maybe a real world case scenario of how these sudden change in the emissions will impact aerosol chemistry and then the resulting aerosols that is being formed. And at the same time, we are also doing quite a bit of work indoors owing to the pandemic. So there's a lot of increasing concern knowing that aerosols can be a medium of transmission for the disease. And so there's a lot of emphasis being placed on the ventilation. And coming back to the ventilation, it requires energy. So if in a world with unlimited energy, you just increase your ventilation. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you maintain really good indoor air quality, but also, in terms of energy use, it is realistic. So we have been doing quite a bit of measurements on campus, indoor in the classroom, to look at the ventilation, look at the aerosol level in these classrooms, and how do we actually maximize all these different knobs that we can turn by opening the windows increasing the ventilation to really reduce the aerosol level in this indoor environments. So this topic of energy and health is not just an outdoor and indoor problem from the air quality perspective. It's really both indoor and outdoor. And Sharon asked about maybe some new projects going into the future. So we recently have a new project funded by NSF to establish 12 sites, measurement sites of aerosols around in the country. And these sites are scattered around in different states. So these will provide really long-term continuous measurements of aerosols in the many years to come. And hopefully these would also help us capture how the transition in the energy landscape will impact air quality. So there's a lot of exciting things going on.
Thanks, Sally. Is there anything about your recent research that you are able to share yet?
So we have started publishing, some of these results from various, projects. And for the indoor air quality, we are working with the Georgia Tech Environmental Health and Safety, and also my students to kind of provide some recommendations in terms of what could be an acceptable way to evaluate indoor air quality, and at the same time, I guess, hopefully, maintain the energy use and control. And in terms of the outdoor air quality, we're still analyzing a lot of these complex data from the COVID-19 pandemic measurements. But we're seeing is that the nitrogen oxide does have a strong impact on the resulting aerosols that is being formed. And so I guess it's a win-win situation if we reduce the nitrogen oxide, because nitrogen oxide itself is a pollutant, and at the same time, it can also reduce the aerosol pollution. So just one reduction in one pollutant end up having multiple benefits.
That's great. One of our guests today, Corey Thompson, wants to know about tire particulate emissions. I'm not familiar with that. He says, or primarily tailpipe type vehicle emissions, which I think this goes back to the NOx particulates that you're speaking of. Yes. I don't know about the tire particulate emissions, but if you can speak to that, if you know anything about that.
Tire is the vehicles. So that one I'm not particularly familiar with, but in general, the vehicles, they do emit different pollutants. So the nitrogen oxides is one type of pollutant that can be directly emitted by vehicles. And also they can emit these particles directly. So if you drive behind a diesel truck, you see these black carbon particles coming on at you. So these pollutants are emitted as particles. But at the same time, these vehicle emissions also contain a class of gas compounds. So these are not particles, they're just gas compounds being emitted, but then they will be reacted in the atmosphere, and at the end, they will form these particles that we are all breathing in. So we call these primary particle pollutants. They're primary because they're directly emitted from a source. And so basically, when you think of vehicle emissions, it really covers various types of pollutants, from the gas phase and also the particle phase. And they can also emit metals, which has been shown to be also really have very bad health impacts.
Great. Corey, I hope that helps answer your question. And Sally, your research it's so interesting. And I'm hoping we can circle back to this in a minute. Because we have some other information on particulates coming in. But right now, I would like to ask Laura if you could tell us something about the research that's happening that you are personally involved in or in your department at this intersection.
Sure. Thank you. And I've as a educator, and maybe it's something to do with economist, I almost find it impossible to speak without PowerPoint slides, much like it's sort of like speaking with your hands. It becomes impossible. So if you'll bear with me and allow me to share my screen for a second, I wanted to just share a couple little slides to be able to keep myself on target. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the clean energy transition, and because that's what we're generally focused on, and distributional equity. And let me, I'm mostly going to be focusing on transportation and the power sector, and actually mostly transportation. When we think about emissions of CO2, you know, a lot of policy goals now around deep decarbonization, right? And so we can see that transportation, the power sector is still, of course, the largest sources of CO2 emissions. And when we decarbonize the grid in particular, I'm going to focus just for a second on decarbonization of the grid, we'll get co-benefits, right? We'll get local health benefits. So of course, there's the benefits associated with climate change and, you know, mitigation, and even, well, I'll just leave it at that. But that's not really the focus that I'm thinking about. When we decarbonize, back in the Obama administration prior to Trump, there was a really detailed analysis of what the benefits of reducing carbon emissions from the power sector by 30% by 2030. And that was from 2005 levels. And the benefits of the carbon reduction were about $6.5 billion. Those were the estimates at the time. The cost of achieving that reduction was estimated to be about $8 billion at the time. So in terms of carbon reductions alone, benefits to the US alone, that was all that was included in the benefit cost analysis. The benefits may not outweigh the cost of the particular regulation that they were looking at. It was the Clean Power Plan back if you all remember that. But what I wanted to highlight was that the co-benefits, the benefits from primarily PM 2.5 reductions, which they estimated to be approximately 25%, those benefits were between 11 and almost 28 billion annually. 81% of the total benefits of reducing carbon pollution from the power sector are due to those health co-benefits. And those health co-benefits are coming primarily from PM 2.5 that Sally alluded to earlier. These are really important. And within those benefits, almost all of the benefits, something like 96 or 98%, come from avoiding premature mortality. And when we think about the power sector and the benefits of moving to renewable and clean energy, while it's not universally true, we think of those benefits as being distributed a little bit more evenly in the population, right? And that's and that power sector benefits really from reducing coal, right? But in this slide, what I'm showing is that the CO2 emissions from petroleum, so in our transportation sector, are perhaps even more important, right, for local health benefits. And, you know, we're all quite familiar with that in the Atlanta region. There's a lot of good work out there that connects near road emissions or on-road emissions to public health impacts for those who are living near these major transportation corridors. It's still an evolving literature, but it exists. We observe, for instance, reduced birth outcomes. There's a paper that looked at near road emissions in the Northeast and how that impacted birth outcomes for mothers. Well, here in some of the research that we're doing, Dylan Brewer in particular, who's a faculty member in the School of Economics, is working with Randy Gunsler and Mike Rogers here at Georgia Tech, as well as Howard Chang and Noah Skowronek at Emory School of Public Health, to use the natural experiment that occurred with COVID-19 and examine how during the shutdown, where on-road transportation sources would have been reduced dramatically, Sources from power companies weren't necessarily reducing it or at all. And look at how that natural variation in on-road transportation emissions impact birth outcomes to mothers that live near highways in Atlanta. That's one project we have ongoing to again, try to connect emissions changes to outcomes that we care about in health using observational data. Another thing that I wanted to point out is thinking about transportation in particular and the distributional benefits of decarbonizing or the transportation sector moving to, say, EVs would be, or even more fuel efficient vehicles. Those technologies aren't available to everyone. So here's a map of the greater metro area, with blue being higher income areas and red being, and particularly focus on the red as being red and orange lower income areas. And you'll see Atlanta right there in the middle, and red sort of is on top of Atlanta and to the south of Atlanta, the lower income areas of the metro area. This is a really interesting figure from Mike Rogers and his and colleagues that looks at the mean age of automobiles related to income, and this is in Atlanta. Okay, and down at the bottom of the graph or the figure are low income, sort of 50,000 to less than 15,000 as your income for a head of household. And you'll see that the age of the vehicle, 9 years is dark red, and that's the mean age, gets quite a bit, cars get older as you are have lower income. That's probably not surprising to anybody. But what's really important about that is cars in the 1990s and even early 2000s, their rate of emissions in PM 2.5 will be 5 to 10-fold higher than a car from 2018. And those emissions aren't distributed evenly in an urban area. They are distributed along corridors, right? You can think about where the transportation patterns are relative to housing stock, and you can think about those connections. And it's not just straightforward public health in the sense of, you think about like in your home or being outdoors and having asthma influence or even heart impacts of pollution. It can be even more nuanced than that. In new work that Dylan Brewer and Daniel Dench and other economists at Georgia Tech, in conjunction with Gary Harris at the Center for Sustainable Communities and Michael Chang and Brooke Byers Institute, Kevin Caravati and others at GTRI, are working on installing sensors in Atlanta area schools for the following reason. So here's a map that Dylan put together that shows the black dots are schools, just the location of schools. And if you will, for a second, focus on the dots that are in the orange and red area. Those are within, orange is, I think, within 1,000 meters of the interstate, and the red area is within 500 meters of an interstate. There's a lot of schools right on top of these interstates, right? And my daughter goes to Midtown High, and her lacrosse practice field sits on top of the connector. I feel like, as a mother who looks at air quality and health outcomes, it pains me sometimes to go to lacrosse practice. Sits right on top of the connector. Well, what we're doing is looking at how educational outcomes can be affected by pollution. There's some really interesting early studies, not early studies, but illustrative studies that are showing that during episodes of high pollution, student test scores go down. And indeed, Dylan has done a quick matching exercise that illustrates this may be a really big deal. He's looked at how schools with that are within 500 meters of these highways as compared to schools with the same characteristics, same percent of free and reduced lunch, same basic socioeconomic characteristics, but nearby, but not near a highway. Schools that are sitting right by the highway have a dramatically lower test scores, not like 1%, like 20% lower test scores. And those kinds of linking the research to say, well, is that effect from the air pollution or something else? That's another project that we have ongoing to really look at these causal influences of air pollution from energy use on the health outcomes. There's lots still to learn, but there's also a lot that we do know. And we know that these benefits are not currently being distributed evenly in society, and it's something to be very careful of as we move into the future.
Laura, that last statistic you gave about the 20% decrease in student, that took my breath away.
It is, it's outstanding. Now I do want to, caveat, first look at the data. So this is not, this is what the research is about, to make sure that that number is, the real number. But even if just looking at the basic differences in means, it's really outstanding. And I believe Dylan's actually in the meeting, and he can put something in the chat, but it can be non-trivial, and that's something that we really do have to understand.
Absolutely. And I am so forever grateful that people like all of you are here studying that and trying to come to get to the bottom of it so we can understand it better and eliminate that disparity. We do have somebody who is requesting a link to that map that you had about vehicle age. And I know that appeared to be internal. Is it published anywhere?
I will check with, I'll check, it's from Mike Rogers. I will double check with him, and I'm pretty sure it was embargoed until it was released, but that last email I had was 9 months ago. So I think it's been released. I'll double check on that, and I'll get those links while others are talking.
Absolutely. And yeah, people are requesting links to get more information. It's such a, I almost can't think that statistic has just blown my mind. So having said that, I want to go ahead and turn this discussion over to Andrea Pinnabel, who, as she stated before, has this background in sustainability and comes from this more corporate perspective of all of these issues. So Andrea, can you talk to us a little bit about the issues as you see them?
Sure. Thanks, Sharon. And I am going to actually dovetail a lot of what Sally and Laura said, but really more focus in on the energy intersection with energy burden and health outcomes, especially across the state. And then hopefully leave people with a sense of that there are some programs out there that the cities and the Smart Cities Initiative can take advantage of. So I too have to show, I just have 2 slides. So let me see here. Okay. All right. So when we think about transportation and the clean energy transition in a low carbon future, right, that PM 2.5 really kind of stuck out both in what Sally said as well as what Laura said, and talking about both the transportation and the movement to electrification of our vehicles and our transportation system, as well as the air quality. When I was at Southface over the last 5 years, Southface is a local nonprofit, does work across not only the region, Southeast region, but also across the nation, specifically focused on improved quality of housing and commercial spaces at that intersection of the natural and built environment. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is work that we did in conjunction with not only Georgia Tech, but also Southface and other partners that we had. But I want to take a step back when we talk about the clean energy transition, we can't forget about energy efficiency. So the cleanest electron is the electron that is never utilized, never generated. And we still have a tremendous amount of buildings, obviously, transportation and the industrial sectors are number one, but we still have a tremendous amount of buildings that are substandard. And when we talk about the equity issues associated with energy burden, let me just go down to the next slide here. You see that it does disproportionately affect those that are lower income. So just to level set everyone, energy burden is the percentage of your household income that is spent on energy. The national average is somewhere between 2.5% and 3%. Georgia ranks really high, and the energy efficiency scorecard, according to the ACEEE, which is the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy, Georgia ranks number 42 out of 50 states. We have over 1.2 million Georgians that are paying more than 6% of their household income. And that dovetails to a lot of what Laura talked about in terms of household income, especially in the city of Atlanta, where Atlanta numbers are actually much higher than some of the places in more of the rural areas. We have households within south of I-20 and near the interstates that have the double whammy, right, of living near an interstate, whether it's I-20 or Langford Parkway or the connector or any of our other interstates, in addition to the health impacts of living in a low-income house that has, very high energy burden. And that has predominant and just tremendous impacts on the health of those people. And I'll give you a scenario that we saw a lot at South Face is that you have a low-income house, let's call it Vine City, and could be in any neighborhood. I'm just using this as an example because it's near tech. And has one air conditioning that's a window unit. In the summer, it's 98 degrees outside, and your average energy bill is $450. So that family then makes the decision to not turn on that air conditioning unit in order to save money because they pay 10 or 12% of their income towards energy efficiency. All of a sudden now you have in a hot, humid climate in the city of Atlanta, you have not only the 2.5 particulate issues that you're dealing with, but now you're dealing with mold spores and other types of social determinants of health and other particulates that are really engaging and really exacerbate some of the health issues. So you have a 6-year-old in this house who has asthma issues and now has an asthma attack, and now they have to go to the hospital and have a $6,000 emergency room visit, as opposed to the $350 a month energy bill. So these are real issues that real families are dealing with. And while I think the global issues of electrification of transportation and the decarbonization is really important, we also know that these statistics are very real for families and trying to pay for, medical bills, schooling, housing, food, all of the other issues. And so as we think about the clean energy transition, and especially those that are on this webinar today, it's really important to think about housing, commercial spaces, nonprofits, and some of these like safety nets across your communities, and how this transition to a clean energy economy can benefit your city, can benefit all of your occupants and your citizens, but most importantly, the citizens and those who are living in the most vulnerable and low-income communities. And the statistic on Atlanta, there is actually a 10-year difference in life expectancy from if you live around Bankhead MARTA Station or if you live around Buckhead MARTA Station. And that is due to health impacts, lack of health care, lack of healthy food. And as Sally and Laura pointed out, additional particulates due to environmental matters like heat island effect, transportation, and other environmental issues. But I don't want to leave you with, with only gloom and doom. So there's a lot of projects that are going on and a lot of really good best practices that are happening today. The DOE under the Biden administration have put together a rework of the weatherization and intergovernmental programs. Some of the highlights of those and some of the major changes are kind of highlighted here. The weatherization assistance program in total, which is essentially helps low-income households reduce that energy burden comparative to other parts of the country. It's funded at $421 million this year. And 400 million of that are in grants and training to support approximately 50,000 low-income residential retrofits. And that's something that the cities can apply for. In the state of Georgia, some of that money is run through GEFA, or the Georgia Environmental Finance Authority, and as well as the Department of Community Affairs, or DCA. So that's really important to understand. There also is $21 million for Weatherization Readiness Fund. And this is what we see a lot in low-income housing and in nonprofits who are traditionally in structural buildings that are not necessarily ready for energy efficiency. And that's that the structures are significantly in disrepair. Holes in the wall, the roof is tore up, there's water intrusion in the bathrooms. All of these things have health and financial impacts. And so the DOE has set aside $21 million for a Weatherization Readiness Fund to fund some of these structural health and safety repairs for low-income housing that is really needed prior to getting the house ready for weatherization, whether it's insulation or weather stripping or water intrusion over correction. So that's some of the opportunities. And then locally, we have some other programs and nonprofits who are really doing some great work. Southface, as I mentioned before, a little biased, but I'll mention them. They have a program called Good Use that is funded philanthropically, where we, I'll always be a we match the grant dollars with a 1-for-1 or 2-for-1 match to really help nonprofits to improve the energy efficiency, the indoor air quality, and the overall health, while also improving the financial capabilities of that nonprofit. The picture you see here is of the Red Shelter, which is a Salvation Army homeless shelter. They reduced energy consumption by 32%, water consumption by 22%. They have solar and storage. This is a homeless shelter for men and women and children transitioning out of homelessness. And by doing this, they're actually able to provide additional programming, as well as they have a global ionization system within the facility that has reduced not only COVID, but flu by 98%. While some of the other shelters were having flu epidemic, this shelter only had 2 cases of flu over the last, annually over the last 3 years. So it's been having some significant issues or significant benefits, co-benefits in addition to energy efficiency. SEFCA, which is a construction training facility, which helps construction ready, trains not only the communities coming out of some of these vulnerable areas, but also the folks who are interested in getting into the construction field, how not only to be construction ready, but also to understand some of the energy efficiency and some of the quote unquote green techniques. And Partnership for Southern Equity, they have a Just Energy Circle that is a combination of community leaders, city leaders, and advocates, as well as the corporate sector, to really not only educate communities around energy efficiency, energy burden, and decarbonization, but also to implement strategies to help those cities move forward. And I think that is it. And then in terms of projects, one of the projects, let me stop sharing here. One of the projects that I've seen have been pretty interesting is on the private sector side, and there's opportunities for research and opportunities for partnerships within communities as well, is one of the projects that I'm currently working on is with a private sector residential client who has about 40,000 homes across the United States. These are homes that would be traditionally first homes for folks, 900 to 2,000 square feet, older homes. And they have gone about a data analysis of all of their units. And they work like an apartment or a condo where they go in, they maintain the homes, but it's a rental facility. And they have a commitment to not only improve the overall indoor air quality and health, but also reduce maintenance and reduce pollutants and reduce costs for their tenants. And we have looked at, different areas across the country where they're actually going to go in and establish processes and establish criteria for retrofitting large swaths of their residential unit portfolio over time. And I think I've seen that over and over again. Another really good example is Atlanta Housing Authority is incentivizing their Section 8 and their voucher program landlords for doing energy efficiency into their homes. So to reduce, to reduce the overall cost of the rental. And finally, DCA, the Department of Community Affairs, has a quality assurance program, which if a developer is developing low-income property, whether it's mixed use, solely residential or commercial, and meets green criteria, so that's energy efficiency criteria, criteria for walkability, as well as for particulate criteria, so away from interstates, they can actually apply for either a 4% tax break and tax incentive from the state in order to do that. So there are programs out there that are really trying to address all of the different issues that we talked about today.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm curious to know if there is a central agency or place or an entity like Southface where a person would go in order to get some more information on all of these programs.
Unfortunately, no. I think that's part of the issue. I think Southface, Partnership for Southern Equity are really good. Department of Energy has a really good weatherization website that I can put into the chat that will allow people to look and see what the grant opportunities are. As does GEFA, Georgia Environmental Finance Authority. They run a lot of the energy programs coming through the state, the Department of Energy's money that comes into the state of Georgia. GEFA is a really good kind of holding place for all of those different grant programs.
Okay, thank you. In the chat, Dylan Brewer had made mention that the results of his study were correlational or not causational. And Laura, I wanted to ask you just really quick, if you could just talk about, the difference between correlation and causation, and maybe about the causal framework that you guys in economics use to separate the two.
Sure, I'd love to. Something near and dear to our heart. So what Dylan was talking about is what he did was compare schools with the same characteristics in terms of the data that we can observe as researchers, right? The percent free and reduced lunch, percent non-white students, and so forth. Size of the school, K through 5 or 6 versus, high school. So you match them. So you're trying to compare outcomes for units or schools that would be identical except for the air pollution, right? So when we think of medical experiments as kind of the holy grail, where people are randomized. Everyone gets a white pill. Some people, it's an actual pill, and some it's a placebo, and neither the doctor nor the patient knows which they have, and you just compare the outcomes. That's that kind of randomized control trial. That's what scientists get to do. Scientists get to run experiments, right? And control everything else except the one thing they're interested in, to see the influence of that one thing on an outcome of interest. Well, in the real world, that's not what we get to do. We can't randomize air pollution amongst the population. We can't randomize income. We can't randomize education. And we know all these things influence health. And we know one of the things that influences health is your exposure to air pollution, right? So the causal framework, an economist, which really permeates most of all empirical economics today, is how can we use clever natural experiments or clever statistical techniques in the absence of perfect data to mimic that randomization, to mimic randomization into treated, higher pollution versus control, lower air pollution, so that we can make statements that it is indeed the air pollution that's causing that reduction in, say, test scores, and not other factors that are either, well, observable or, more importantly, unobservable to the researcher, right? Something about the school, like, for instance, another example could be maybe the school has a mold problem, right? And maybe it just happened to be that schools along a highway also happened to be in a flood zone, also happened to be, had previous floods. But as a researcher, we didn't know it, and we mistakenly say it was due to air pollution. So that's the causal framework that the Strategic Energy Institute and the Energy Policy and Innovation Center are helping to fund in seed grants for us to really bring sort of a causal framework and pull all the pieces from both Georgia Tech and Emory together to really try to nail down these causal effects of various types of air pollution or various situations like transportation related emissions on health outcomes. I put a couple studies. I think I put all the links in that folks were asking. An example of a really good in this kind of causal framework paradigm, a good study. It was in Israel about how on high pollution days, test scores went down in really high stakes tests. Like if it's the day that you're taking an SAT, it affects what college you go to, right? And then that has implications for lifetime earnings, right? So these are all the kinds of really important impacts that it's just really important for us to understand still. We still have a long way to go.
That is fascinating. I feel now like I need to go sit into some economics classes and learn more. And I think as we are ending our, coming close to the end of our time here, goes by so fast. I want to focus on Georgia a little bit and what is unique to Georgia. We clearly have assets. We've got Georgia Tech, you've got Southface, Emory, CDC, but we also have some barriers. And Sally, our weather is a barrier, is it not, in the formation of like helping form some of these criteria pollutants?
Yeah, like we are in a very interesting spot, I guess, nationally in terms of our emissions that are quite different from, a lot of places. We have these mixtures of emissions from a lot of vehicles, power plants, and also from natural emissions from trees. If you look at a photo of Atlanta, we are a city in the ocean of forests or trees. And the one thing about how aerosols or PM 2.5 form in the atmosphere is that this is a very non-linear process. It's not that 1 + 1 = 2. And once you think about all these different emission sources of nitrogen oxides from cars, carbon dioxide from power plants, VOCs from different vehicle emissions, and then all these emissions, from trees. We are really talking about a big pot of soup. And there's a lot of non-linear chemistry that is happening. So it's interesting that Laura talked about this control experiments, right? Because that's actually typically what we do in atmospheric chemistry, that you have these 5 pollutants that can coexist, and they have different reactions among each other, and how these interactions actually take place in the environment that result in PM 2.5 of different composition. So, one of the projects we got funded with SEI is also to look at how chemical composition of particular matter links to their health effects. So not all particles are made the same. We are all different, right? So one thing to really recognize is that all these particles that we are breathing in, indoor and outdoor, all have very different, chemical compositions, and then would have very different health effects. So there's just a lot. We are in a unique place, and then there's just a lot of great opportunities we can pursue with expertise in fundamental atmospheric science, engineering, and also the health impacts and the economic impacts, because all these are really tied together.
Absolutely. And for our audience today, I want to say we're coming up close. So if you have any questions you would like to ask today, now is the time to ask them. I think what I love about this panel is that you guys are all addressing and trying to solve this problem in your way. And it's a very sticky problem. It's this intersection between technology and all of these social factors. And some of the factors, are depending on other factors, and teasing that all apart is difficult. And that just goes to show how big this problem is. We have been told this is going to be recorded, and this recording will be made available in case you guys do want to share this. So in the absence of any audience questions, I'd like to ask my panelists if there's anything at the end you would like to address, something maybe I forgot to mention before we leave.
No, just thank you so much for having us.
Great. This has been absolutely wonderful. I want to thank all of the audience members for coming. And I also want to especially thank our panelists for giving up their time to spend with us today on this important topic. So we've got some thank yous coming up in the chat box to the panelists. And if you want more information on energy and public health, you can contact us at SEI, and we will be happy to talk with you about this topic. And I guess this is where we say goodbye. We don't have any more questions coming through. So it is goodbye. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.